Kira Thorne adjusted her oversized hoodie for the 100th time that morning, pulling it down to cover as much of her small frame as possible. At barely 5 feet tall, with wild curly hair that refused to be tamed and thick-rimmed glasses that seemed to engulf half her face, she had learned early on that invisibility was her best defense at Roosevelt High School. The sprawling brick building, with its maze of hallways and endless stream of students, had become her prison for the past 3 months since her family moved from Oregon. The transition had been brutal in ways she hadn't anticipated, leaving behind the familiar comfort of her old school, where she had managed to carve out a small but safe niche among the drama club kids and book enthusiasts. She clutched her worn backpack straps tighter as she navigated through the crowded hallway, dodging groups of students who barely acknowledged her existence. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors where her sneakers squeaked softly with each careful step. Her destination was always the same: the library, where she could disappear among the stacks of books and pretend the outside world didn't exist. Mrs. Chen, the librarian, had become her unofficial guardian angel, always greeting her with a warm smile and never asking too many questions about why she spent so much time there. The hallways of Roosevelt High were like a complex ecosystem with clearly defined territories and hierarchies that Kira had quickly learned to navigate. The jocks owned the main corridor near the gymnasium, their letterman jackets like badges of authority that granted them passage anywhere they pleased. The popular girls claimed the area near the cafeteria, their perfectly coordinated outfits and synchronized laughter creating an invisible barrier that repelled anyone who didn't meet their unspoken standards. The theater kids gathered near the auditorium, their dramatic gestures and animated conversations providing a constant source of entertainment for anyone within earshot. And then there were the spaces in between, the forgotten corners and unused classrooms where kids like Kira tried to exist without drawing attention to themselves. She had mapped out every shortcut, every alternate route that might help her avoid the main thoroughfares where danger lurked. Her schedule was carefully planned around the movements of certain individuals, particularly one whose presence could turn an ordinary day into a nightmare. Well, what do we have here?" The voice cut through the morning chatter like a blade. Kira's stomach dropped as she recognized the sneering tone of Blake Morrison, the self-appointed king of Roosevelt High. Standing at over 6 feet, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of confident swagger that came from never being told no, Blake commanded attention wherever he went. His letterman jacket stretched across broad shoulders, and his green eyes held a cruel glint that made Kira's skin crawl. The jacket itself was a symbol of his dominance, adorned with patches and pins that documented his achievements on the football field and his status as team captain. Flanking him were his loyal followers: Trevor Walsh, a stocky redhead with freckles and a permanent scowl, and Danny Russo, whose dark hair was always slicked back and whose laugh sounded like nails on a chalkboard. Together, they formed an intimidating triangle that blocked Kira's path to the library. Trevor was the muscle of the group, his thick frame and quick temper making him the perfect enforcer for Blake's schemes. Danny, meanwhile, was the strategist, always coming up with new and creative ways to torment their victims while staying just within the bounds of what teachers might consider harmless teenage behavior. "Look, guys, it's the little mouse," Blake continued, his voice dripping with mock sympathy, "still trying to hide in that tent you call a sweatshirt." Kira's heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to sidestep around them, but Trevor moved to block her path. Students began to slow down, sensing drama, but none dared to intervene. This was Blake's domain, and everyone knew better than to challenge him. The unspoken rule of Roosevelt High was simple: stay out of Blake's way, don't draw his attention, and pretend you didn't see anything when he decided to entertain himself at someone else's expense. "I'm just trying to get to class," Kira mumbled. her voice barely audible above the hallway noise. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, students slowing their pace to watch the familiar ritual unfold. Some looked genuinely uncomfortable, their faces showing traces of sympathy or guilt, but none were willing to risk becoming Blake's next target. "What was that?" Blake cupped his ear theatrically. "I can't hear you over all that mumbling. Maybe if you didn't dress like a homeless person, people might actually want to listen to what you have to say." Danny snickered, and Trevor cracked his knuckles. The sound made Kira flinch, a reaction that only seemed to encourage them further. What they didn't know, what nobody at Roosevelt High knew, was that Kira had been studying Krav Maga since she was 8 years old. Her father, a former military contractor, had insisted she learn to defend herself after a break-in at their old house. David Thorne had spent 15 years working in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and he understood better than most how quickly a seemingly safe situation could turn deadly. The training had started simply enough, with basic self-defense moves taught in their garage on weekend mornings. But as Kira grew older and more skilled, her father had enrolled her in a proper martial arts academy. Master Liu, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, who moved with the fluid grace of someone half his age, had become her mentor and guide. Under his tutelage, Kira had learned not just the physical techniques of Krav Maga, but its philosophy as well. The art was designed for real-world combat situations, teaching students to end fights quickly and decisively while minimizing harm to themselves. For years, she had trained 3 times a week, learning to turn an attacker's strength against them, to strike with precision and devastating effect. Her small frame was deceptive. Beneath the oversized clothing lay muscles honed by countless hours of practice, reflexes sharpened by sparring sessions that left her exhausted but exhilarated. She could break boards with her bare hands, execute throws that would send someone twice her size sprawling, and strike pressure points that would leave an attacker helpless. But she couldn't use those skills. Not here. Not against fellow students. Her father had drilled into her that martial arts were for life-or-death situations, not schoolyard conflicts. Violence should always be the last resort, he had told her countless times during their long conversations about responsibility and restraint. Walk away when you can. Fight only when you must. The moment you use your training in anger or for revenge, you dishonor everything Master Liu has taught you. The philosophical foundation of Krav Maga emphasized survival over victory, protection over aggression. It was designed to help people escape dangerous situations, not to dominate or humiliate opponents. Master Liu had spent hours teaching Kira about the difference between necessary force and excessive violence, about the responsibility that came with possessing skills that could seriously injure another person. Power without wisdom is destruction, he would often say. Strength without compassion is tyranny. So she endured. Day after day, week after week, she swallowed her pride and her training, telling herself it would get better, that they would get bored and move on to someone else. She practiced her breathing exercises in bathroom stalls, used meditation techniques to calm her racing heart, and channeled her frustration into her training sessions at Master Liu's academy. Her instructor had noticed the change in her demeanor, the way her movements had become more aggressive during sparring practice, but he wisely chose to guide rather than lecture. She was wrong about Blake and his friends getting bored. The incidents escalated slowly at first, like a tide gradually rising until suddenly the shore was underwater. Blake would accidentally knock her books from her hands in the hallway, sending papers scattering across the floor while students stepped over them without a second glance. The first time it happened, Kira had hoped it really was an accident, despite the smirk she caught on Blake's face as he walked away. But when it happened again the next day, and the day after that, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Trevor would bump into her hard enough to send her stumbling into lockers, the metal clanging, echoing through the corridor like a dinner bell announcing feeding time to predators. Each collision was carefully calculated to look accidental to any casual observer, but the force behind them spoke of deliberate intent. Danny would make loud comments about her appearance whenever she passed, each word carefully chosen to maximize humiliation while maintaining plausible deniability if questioned by a teacher. "Check out the fashion statement," Danny would announce loudly to his friends as Kira hurried past. "I think she shops in the dumpster behind Goodwill." His voice would carry just far enough to ensure that surrounding students heard every word, their uncomfortable laughter mixing with her burning shame. The psychological warfare was perhaps more devastating than any physical attack could have been. They seemed to understand instinctively that public humiliation was her greatest fear, that being the center of negative attention was a special kind of torture for someone who had spent her entire life trying to remain invisible. They turned her desire for anonymity against her, making her hyper-aware of every stare, every whisper, every sideways glance from her classmates. Her teachers, for the most part, seemed oblivious to what was happening. Mr. Peterson, her history teacher, was too absorbed in his lectures about ancient civilizations to notice the modern-day bullying occurring in his classroom. Mrs. Hendricks, who taught mathematics, was kind enough but seemed to exist in a world of equations and theorems that left little room for awareness of teenage social dynamics. Even when incidents occurred directly in front of them, the teachers seemed to view them through a lens of willful blindness, perhaps believing that acknowledging the problem would somehow make it their responsibility to solve. The cafeteria became a minefield that required careful navigation and strategic timing. Kira learned to time her entrance carefully, waiting until Blake and his crew were already seated before making her move. She would grab a sandwich and find an empty table in the corner, hoping to eat in peace. But peace was a luxury she couldn't afford in the social battlefield of Roosevelt High's lunch period. The cafeteria itself was a study in teenage hierarchy, with each table representing a different stratum of the school's social order. The popular kids occupied the prime real estate near the windows, their conversations punctuated by bursts of laughter that seemed choreographed for maximum impact. The athletes had claimed the tables closest to the kitchen, their massive appetites requiring quick access to additional food. The academic achievers huddled together near the far wall, their lunch periods often spent completing homework assignments and studying for upcoming tests. And then there were the outcasts, the misfits, the kids who didn't quite fit into any clearly defined category. They scattered themselves among the remaining tables like survivors of some social shipwreck, eating quickly and quietly while trying to avoid drawing attention from the apex predators who prowled the room looking for entertainment. "Hey, Mouse!" Blake's voice boomed across the cafeteria during lunch on a particularly cruel Tuesday in early October. "Why don't you come sit with us? We promise not to bite." The entire cafeteria turned to look as Kira froze, her turkey sandwich halfway to her mouth. Heat flooded her cheeks as dozens of eyes focused on her, waiting to see what would happen next. She could feel her hands trembling as she set down her food, the simple act of putting the sandwich on her tray requiring tremendous concentration to keep from dropping it entirely. The attention felt like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. Conversations had stopped at nearby tables, replaced by the kind of expectant silence that precedes either a spectacular crash or a narrow escape. She could see phones being discreetly pulled out, their owners hoping to capture whatever humiliation was about to unfold for later sharing on social media. "I'm fine here, thanks," she managed to say, her voice stronger than she felt. The words came out clearly enough to carry across the room, but she could hear the slight tremor that betrayed her fear. "Oh, but I insist!" Blake stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet space. "Trevor, Danny, why don't you go escort our friend over here?" The two boys rose like trained attack dogs, their grins predatory. Kira's muscles tensed, her body automatically shifting into a defensive stance before she caught herself. Her training was trying to take over, her nervous system flooding with adrenaline as it prepared for combat. She forced her shoulders to relax, her hands to unclench. She couldn't fight, not here, not now. As Trevor and Danny approached, weaving between tables with the confident swagger of enforcers carrying out their boss's orders, Kira grabbed her backpack and hurried toward the exit. The sound of their laughter followed her out of the cafeteria, echoing in her ears long after she'd escaped to the safety of an empty classroom. The humiliation burned in her chest like acid, eating away at what little confidence she had managed to maintain. Mrs. Patterson, her English teacher, looked up from her desk with concern as Kira slipped into the room. Margaret Patterson had been teaching at Roosevelt High for nearly 20 years, and she had developed an intuition for students in distress. Something about Kira's posture, the way she held herself like someone expecting a blow, triggered her protective instincts. "Kira, is everything all right, dear?" "I'm fine," Kira lied, settling into a desk near the window where she could watch the parking lot and lose herself in the steady stream of cars passing by. "Just wanted to get some reading done before class." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a moment, her kind eyes seeing more than Kira wanted to reveal. She had been a teenager once herself, long enough ago that the specific details had faded, but recently enough that she remembered the unique pain of adolescent cruelty. But she also knew that teenagers rarely confided in adults about their social problems, preferring to handle things themselves even when they were clearly in over their heads. "You know," Mrs. Patterson said casually, returning to her grading but keeping her voice warm and inviting, "if you ever need someone to talk to, my door is always open. Sometimes it helps to have an adult perspective on things." Kira nodded, grateful for the offer, even though she had no intention of taking it. How could she explain that the problem wasn't just Blake and his friends, but the entire social ecosystem of the school that allowed their behavior to flourish? How could she describe the way their torment had become such a regular part of her day that she had started planning her schedule around it, like someone might plan around rush hour traffic or bad weather? It was the same response Kira received from all the teachers. They saw what was happening, but nobody wanted to get involved. It was easier to look the other way, to pretend that teenage cruelty was just a normal part of growing up. The adults in her life seemed to operate under the assumption that kids needed to work these things out for themselves, that intervention would somehow rob them of important life lessons about resilience and character building. But what they didn't understand was that some lessons were more destructive than educational, that some forms of resilience came at too high a cost. Every day that Blake and his friends were allowed to continue their campaign of torment was another day that Kira's sense of self-worth eroded a little more. She was learning lessons, all right, but they were lessons about powerlessness, about accepting abuse, about the fundamental unfairness of a world where strength and cruelty were rewarded while kindness and vulnerability were punished. The gymnasium presented its own unique set of challenges, an arena where Blake's physical advantages were most pronounced and where the veneer of athletic competition provided perfect cover for more targeted harassment. During mandatory physical education, Blake would accidentally throw balls at her head during dodgeball, the rubber spheres connecting with sickening thuds that left her ears ringing and her vision momentarily blurred. Coach Martinez, a former college football player whose coaching philosophy seemed centered around the belief that character was built through adversity, would blow his whistle and call it an accident. "Shake it off, Thorne," he would shout from the sidelines. "In my day, we'd walk off a hit like that." But the smirk on Blake's face told a different story, and the way his throws seemed to find her with uncanny accuracy suggested that his aim was far better than any accident would allow. "Sorry, Mouse," Blake would say with false sincerity, jogging over with his hands raised in a gesture of innocent concern. Guess you need to work on those reflexes. If only he knew about her reflexes. If only he knew that she could have caught that ball and thrown it back hard enough to knock him flat on his back. That her reaction time had been honed by years of training with opponents who moved faster and hit harder than he could imagine. But she gritted her teeth and rubbed her bruised shoulder, saving her rage for her punching bag at home. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same physical education class where she was being victimized was also the one place where her true capabilities might have been most apparent. She was careful to hide her athleticism, deliberately performing below her capabilities to avoid drawing attention. When they ran laps around the track, she held herself back to finish in the middle of the pack, despite the fact that her cardiovascular conditioning was probably better than most of the varsity athletes. During strength training, she lifted weights that were embarrassingly light for someone with her actual capabilities, all in service of maintaining the illusion that she was exactly as weak and helpless as she appeared. The deception required constant vigilance and careful calculation. She had to remember to breathe hard after moderate exertion, to struggle with tasks that should have been simple for someone with her training. It was exhausting in its own way, this constant performance of weakness, this deliberate suppression of everything she had worked so hard to develop. The locker room was the worst part of the entire school experience, a place where the usual rules of civilized behavior seemed to evaporate entirely. Away from the watchful eyes of teachers and administrators, Blake and his friends felt free to escalate their torment to levels that would have been unthinkable in more public spaces. The locker room had a lawless quality to it, like the Wild West or some post-apocalyptic wasteland where only the strong survived and the weak were left to fend for themselves. They would hide her clothes while she showered, forcing her to search frantically while wrapped in a towel that felt inadequate against both the cold air and the hungry stares of her tormentors. The first time it happened, she had nearly panicked, standing dripping wet in the shower area while trying to figure out what to do. The sound of their muffled laughter from somewhere in the maze of lockers had been almost worse than the immediate problem of her missing clothes. They would slam locker doors near her head, the metallic crashes making her jump and sending adrenaline spiking through her system. The timing was always perfect, designed to catch her when she was most vulnerable and least prepared. Sometimes they would coordinate their efforts, creating a symphony of slamming metal that echoed through the tiled space like gunshots. Once, they filled her backpack with shaving cream, ruining her textbooks and homework assignments in a mess of white foam and dissolved paper. The destruction had been thorough and deliberate, with the cream worked into every pocket and compartment until nothing was salvageable. The cost of replacing the books would strain her family's already tight budget, but explaining what had happened would require admitting the full extent of what she was enduring. Through it all, Kira remained silent. She cleaned up the messes, replaced her belongings with money carefully saved from her part-time job at a local bookstore, and tried to convince herself that ignoring them would make them lose interest. But bullies feed on reactions, and her obvious distress only made them hungry for more. Each incident seemed to embolden them further, convincing them that she was an inexhaustible source of entertainment with no capacity to fight back. The pattern became so predictable that Kira found herself developing elaborate coping strategies just to survive each day. She learned to change clothes quickly, to keep her most important belongings in a hidden compartment of her backpack, to time her movements to minimize exposure to their attacks. She became an expert at reading the subtle signs that indicated when they were planning something special, the way they would cluster together and whisper, the particular quality of their grins that suggested incoming cruelty. Her home life provided some respite, but even there the effects of the constant stress were becoming apparent. Her parents, David and Sarah Thorne, had noticed changes in their daughter's behavior since the move to Roosevelt High. She was more withdrawn, less likely to share details about her day, more prone to spending hours alone in her room. They attributed it to the normal difficulties of adjusting to a new school, a new social environment, not realizing that their daughter was fighting a daily battle just to survive. David Thorne, with his military background and understanding of conflict dynamics, might have recognized the signs if Kira had been willing to share the full truth. But she had become skilled at deflecting their questions, at providing just enough information to satisfy their concern without revealing the extent of her suffering. "School's fine," she would say when asked about her day. "Just trying to find my place, you know." Her training sessions with Master Liu became increasingly important as an outlet for her frustration and fear. The elderly instructor had begun to notice subtle changes in her technique, a hardness creeping into her movements that spoke of anger held too long in check. During sparring practice, she hit the pads with more force than necessary, her combinations flowing with a violence that went beyond mere technical proficiency. "Your spirit is troubled," Master Liu observed one evening after a particularly intense training session. They were alone in the dojo, the other students having already left for the day. The space felt peaceful in the dim lighting, with its smell of canvas mats and the faint echo of years of dedicated practice. Kira paused in her cool-down stretches, not quite meeting her instructor's eyes. "I'm fine, Master Liu, just trying to improve my technique." The old man studied her with the penetrating gaze of someone who had spent decades reading the subtle signs of human emotion. "Technique without purpose is mere violence. What troubles you, child?" For a moment, Kira was tempted to tell him everything, to describe the daily humiliations, the constant fear, the way Blake and his friends had turned her school experience into a waking nightmare. But she held back, knowing that Master Liu would feel obligated to contact her parents or the school authorities, and that such intervention would likely make her situation worse rather than better. "Just normal teenage stuff," she said finally. "Nothing I can't handle." Master Liu nodded slowly, but his expression suggested that he wasn't entirely convinced. "Remember," he said as she gathered her gear to leave, "the greatest strength is knowing when not to use your power. But sometimes the greatest weakness is failing to act when action is required." His words stayed with her as she walked to her father's car in the parking lot. As they drove home through the quiet suburban streets, as she lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling and wondering how much longer she could endure. The weight of his wisdom pressed against the reality of her situation, creating a tension that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in mid-November, during that grey stretch of the year when winter was beginning to assert itself but hadn't yet delivered the clean, fresh snow that might make the cold feel worth enduring. Kira was walking to her locker after biology class, her mind focused on the weekend ahead and the blessed 2-day reprieve from Blake's torment. The biology test had gone well, one of the few bright spots in what had become an increasingly dark academic year. For a brief moment, she had allowed herself to feel something approaching normal teenage satisfaction at her academic achievement. She was thinking about the new Krav Maga techniques her instructor had shown her the night before, complex combinations that required split-second timing and perfect form. Master Liu had been working with her on advanced defenses against multiple attackers, scenarios that were designed to prepare students for the kind of real-world conflicts that might arise in dangerous neighborhoods or foreign countries. The techniques were beautiful in their efficiency, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next, like a deadly dance, choreographed by someone who understood human anatomy at its most fundamental level. She didn't notice Blake and his friends waiting by her locker until it was too late. "There she is," Blake announced loudly, drawing the attention of nearby students who were beginning their own weekend exodus. The invisible girl herself. The hallway was busier than usual, filled with students eager to begin their weekend plans. Some were heading to football games, others to parties or movie dates or family dinners. The energy was lighter than during the regular school week, but that same festive atmosphere also meant more witnesses to whatever Blake had planned. Kira approached cautiously, her key ready to quickly open her locker and grab her things. The weekend bag she had packed that morning contained clothes for a sleepover at her cousin's house, the first social invitation she had received since moving to Roosevelt High. Her cousin Rachel was 2 years older and attended a different school district, providing a welcome escape from the social dynamics that had come to dominate Kira's life. But as she reached for the combination lock, Trevor's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was strong, his fingers digging into her skin with enough pressure to leave marks. The contact sent an immediate shock through her system, her training kicking in as her body recognized the beginning of a physical confrontation. "Not so fast, Mouse," he sneered. "We want to talk to you." "Let go of me," Kira said, trying to pull her arm free. But Trevor's grip was strong, his fingers digging into her skin. She could feel the bones in her wrist grinding together under the pressure, and her hand was beginning to go numb. Her training screamed at her to break the grip, using one of a dozen techniques she had practiced thousands of times, but she forced herself to remain still. "You know what I think?" Blake stepped closer, his presence looming over her like a storm cloud blocking out the sun. His cologne was expensive and overpowering, probably chosen more for its price tag than its actual scent. "I think you're hiding something. Nobody's that much of a loser without a reason." The accusation hit closer to home than Blake could have known. She was hiding something, multiple somethings, but not what he was imagining. She was hiding years of training that could have ended their harassment in seconds. She was hiding the kind of conditioning that allowed her to break boards with her bare hands and throw opponents twice her size. She was hiding reflexes honed to the point where she could react to attacks before her conscious mind had even registered the threat. "Maybe she's got scars under that hoodie," Danny suggested with a cruel laugh that echoed off the metal lockers. "Maybe that's why she covers up all the time." The suggestion sparked something vicious in Blake's eyes, a hunger for discovery that went beyond simple bullying into something more invasive and predatory. This wasn't just about asserting dominance anymore. This was about violation, about stripping away the last vestiges of privacy and dignity that Kira had managed to maintain. Blake's eyes lit up with malicious interest. "Is that it, Mouse? Are you hiding something under there?" Before Kira could react, Blake's hand shot out and grabbed the front of her hoodie. The fabric stretched and pulled as he yanked at it, trying to lift it up. The material was old and worn, a hand-me-down from her older brother that had become her armor against the world. Now it was being used against her, transformed from protection into a weapon for her own humiliation. Kira's hands flew to her shirt, trying to hold it down, but Blake was stronger and more determined. The struggle attracted more attention, students stopping to watch as the confrontation escalated beyond the usual verbal harassment into something more physical and desperate. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice cracking with panic and rage. "Leave me alone!" But Blake didn't stop. If anything, her distress seemed to fuel him, like a predator that had tasted blood and was now driven by instinct rather than conscious thought. He pulled harder, the fabric straining against his grip. Students began to gather, forming a circle around the confrontation like spectators at a gladiatorial combat. Some pulled out their phones, ready to record whatever happened next, their faces showing a mixture of excitement and uncomfortable voyeurism. "Come on, Mouse," Blake taunted, his fingers twisted in her hoodie. "What are you so afraid of showing us?" The physical contact, the violation of her personal space, the public humiliation, it all combined to push Kira closer to a breaking point she had been approaching for months. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, her vision beginning to tunnel as her body prepared for fight or flight. Every instinct screamed at her to end this confrontation using the skills that had been drilled into her through years of dedicated practice. That's when she saw her. Emma Rodriguez stood at the edge of the crowd, her dark eyes wide with concern and something that might have been admiration for the way Kira was refusing to back down completely. Emma was everything Kira wasn't: confident, popular, beautiful. Her long black hair fell in perfect waves around her shoulders, and her smile could light up a room. She moved through the school's social hierarchy with an ease that Kira envied, equally comfortable talking to teachers, jocks, artists, or academic achievers. They had been lab partners in chemistry for the past month, a pairing that had initially terrified Kira, but had gradually become one of the few bright spots in her school experience. Emma had always been kind to her, treating her like a real person instead of an annoyance to be ignored. Their conversations during lab work had revealed Emma to be intelligent and thoughtful, with interests that ranged from environmental science to classic literature to foreign films that played at the independent theater downtown. "Blake, stop," Emma said, pushing through the crowd with a determination that surprised even Kira. Her voice carried the kind of natural authority that came from genuine confidence rather than manufactured dominance. "Leave her alone." Blake's grip on Kira's hoodie loosened slightly as he turned to face Emma, clearly not having expected this particular development. Emma's intervention represented a shift in the power dynamics that had previously seemed so clear-cut. Popular students didn't typically involve themselves in the affairs of outcasts, and Blake seemed momentarily uncertain about how to proceed. Well, if it isn't the do-gooder," Blake said, his voice taking on a different tone now that he was addressing someone from his own social stratum. "This doesn't concern you, Emma. It concerns me when you're attacking someone who can't defend themselves," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. She stepped closer, positioning herself partially between Blake and Kira in a gesture that was both protective and defiant. The crowd sensed the escalation, phones now openly recording as students anticipated that this confrontation was about to become something much more significant than the usual harassment session. The hallway had become an arena, with invisible boundaries marking the space where this drama would play out to its conclusion. Blake's expression darkened, his face taking on the kind of ugly twist that revealed the cruelty that had always lurked beneath his charming exterior. "You know what, Emma? Maybe you need to learn the same lesson as your little friend here." He released Kira's hoodie and moved toward Emma, his intentions clear. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Emma stood her ground, but Kira could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly despite her brave facade. This was what Blake did best, escalating situations until his victims had no choice but to submit or face consequences that seemed far worse than simply enduring his abuse. And that's when something inside Kira snapped. The sound was almost audible, like a cable stretched beyond its breaking point suddenly giving way. Years of training, months of humiliation, and a lifetime of being told to walk away suddenly meant nothing. Blake had crossed a line by threatening Emma, and Kira wasn't going to let him hurt the only person who had shown her kindness in this place that had become her personal hell. Every lesson from Master Liu about restraint and proportional response seemed to evaporate in an instant, replaced by a cold fury that was both terrifying and liberating. She had spent so much energy trying to be someone she wasn't, trying to hide her capabilities, trying to fit into a world that seemed determined to reject her. But Emma's intervention had changed the equation entirely. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about protecting someone who had risked her own social standing to defend her. "Get away from her," Kira said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge that made Blake pause mid-stride. The words came out with a clarity and force that surprised everyone present, including Kira herself. For the first time in months, she wasn't mumbling or trying to avoid attention. She was projecting her voice with the kind of confidence that her training had instilled in her, the voice of someone who was prepared to back up their words with action. Blake turned back to her with a laugh that sounded forced and somewhat uncertain. "Oh, look, the mouse found her voice. What are you going to do about it, freak?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that couldn't be ignored. What was she going to do about it? For months, the answer had been nothing. She had absorbed their abuse, cleaned up their messes, and told herself that endurance was the same thing as strength. But now, with Emma watching and her own dignity finally outweighing her desire for invisibility, she realized that sometimes the greatest act of self-respect was refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. Blake lunged at Kira, his hand reaching for her hoodie again with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced real resistance. But this time, she was ready. Everything slowed down as her training kicked in, years of muscle memory and conditioned responses taking over from conscious thought. She could see the trajectory of his movement, the openings in his defense, the perfect moment to strike. Her hand shot up and caught his wrist before his fingers could make contact with her clothing. Her grip found the pressure point that Master Liu had shown her hundreds of times, that precise spot where the median nerve ran close to the surface of the skin. Blake's eyes widened in surprise and pain as his grip went limp, his hand suddenly unable to maintain its strength. "What the hell?" Blake started to say, but Kira wasn't finished. Before he could complete the sentence, she pivoted on her heel with the fluid grace of someone who had practiced the movement thousands of times. She used his own momentum against him, redirecting the force of his attack and sending him stumbling backward toward the lockers. The technique was called a redirect and unbalance in the clinical terminology of her training, but in practice it looked like magic. A small girl somehow managing to move a much larger opponent with what appeared to be minimal effort. Blake crashed into the metal lockers with a sound that echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. The impact was hard enough to dent the thin metal and knock him off balance, but not hard enough to cause serious injury. Kira had calibrated the force perfectly, using exactly as much power as necessary to neutralize the immediate threat without crossing the line into excessive violence. "I said get away from her," Kira repeated, her voice calm and controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Trevor and Danny, who had been watching the exchange with growing amazement, suddenly snapped out of their stupor and moved to flank her. They had never seen Blake handled so easily, and their worldview was struggling to process what they had just witnessed. But loyalty to their leader and the momentum of the situation carried them forward, even as their confidence began to waver. Kira was already calculating angles and distances, her training automatically assessing the threats and formulating responses. Two opponents, one slightly to her left and one to her right, both larger than her, but moving with the kind of uncoordinated aggression that suggested they had never been in a real fight. Trevor was favoring his right side, probably due to an old football injury that affected his mobility. Danny was leading with his chin, a classic mistake that left him vulnerable to a dozen different attacks. When Trevor swung at her, his punch was telegraphed from across the hallway. Kira could see it coming long before his fist began to move, could read the intention in his shoulders and the shift of his weight. She ducked under his arm with economical grace, staying low and close to his body where his size advantage became a liability rather than an asset. Her leg swept out in a classic foot sweep, catching Trevor behind the ankle at the exact moment when his weight was shifting forward. The technique was simple but devastating, using leverage and timing rather than brute force to send him crashing to the ground. Trevor hit the polished floor hard, his breath exploding from his lungs in a whoosh that suggested he would be staying down for a while. Danny hesitated for a moment, clearly reconsidering his life choices as he watched his friend writhing on the floor. But Blake's angry shout from behind him spurred him into action, overriding his better judgment with the kind of mob mentality that turned normally rational people into participants in collective stupidity. Danny charged at her like a bull, all muscle and no technique, his approach exactly what Kira had expected from someone whose fighting experience was limited to shoving matches and the occasional drunken brawl. His size should have been an advantage, but his complete lack of skill turned it into a weakness that she could exploit with surgical precision. Kira sidestepped at the last second, her movement so smooth that it looked almost casual to the watching crowd. As Danny thundered past her, carried forward by his own momentum, she grabbed his outstretched arm and used a basic hip throw to redirect his energy. The technique was one of the first throws Master Liu had taught her, so fundamental that she could execute it perfectly even under extreme stress. Danny flew over her shoulder and hit the ground with an impact that shook the floor. The throw was picture perfect, a textbook example of how to use an opponent's size and aggression against them. He rolled across the polished surface and came to rest against the opposite wall, the wind knocked out of him and his confidence shattered. The crowd gasped, phones recording every moment as the narrative they thought they understood was completely rewritten before their eyes. The quiet mouse who had endured months of abuse was systematically dismantling her tormentors with a skill and precision that belonged in action movies rather than high school hallways. Blake stared at his fallen friends in disbelief before turning back to Kira with rage blazing in his eyes. His carefully constructed image of dominance was crumbling in real time, broadcast live to the social media accounts of dozens of his classmates. The humiliation was total and public, the kind of viral embarrassment that would follow him for the rest of his high school career. "You little freak!" he snarled, pulling back his fist with the kind of wild anger that comes from having one's worldview shattered. "I'm going to destroy you." Blake's punch came fast and hard, driven by fury rather than technique, but Kira had been expecting it. She had seen the rage building in his eyes, had read the tension in his shoulders that telegraphed his intention. His attack was powerful but uncontrolled, the kind of wild swing that might work against an untrained opponent but was almost useless against someone who knew how to fight. She leaned back just far enough to let his fist whistle past her face, feeling the wind from its passage brush against her cheek. The movement was minimal but perfectly timed, a demonstration of defensive skill that spoke to years of practice against opponents who hit much harder and faster than Blake ever could. As his punch missed its target, Kira grabbed his extended arm and stepped forward, using his own momentum to pull him off balance. Her hand found his elbow joint, applying pressure with the kind of precision that came from intimate knowledge of human anatomy. The technique was called an arm bar in martial arts terminology, but Master Liu preferred to call it a teaching moment, an opportunity to demonstrate the consequences of aggressive behavior without causing permanent damage. Blake cried out in pain as Kira applied steady pressure to his elbow joint, forcing him to his knees on the polished floor. The position was both physically uncomfortable and psychologically devastating, transforming the self-appointed king of Roosevelt High into a supplicant begging for mercy. "You want to know what I'm hiding?" Kira said, her voice calm and controlled despite the chaos around them. Her words carried clearly through the hallway, audible to every member of the crowd that had gathered to witness this confrontation. "I'm hiding the fact that I could have ended this months ago. I'm hiding the fact that I've been trained to hurt people, and I chose not to use that training because I thought you might eventually grow up." She applied more pressure, and Blake gasped in pain, his tough guy facade cracking like ice under pressure. The great Blake Morrison, terror of Roosevelt High, was completely at the mercy of the girl he had spent months calling Mouse. The reversal was so complete, so total, that it seemed almost surreal to the students watching. "But you just made a mistake," Kira continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. You threatened someone I care about, and now I'm done playing nice. Blake tried to break free, twisting and pulling against her grip, but Kira's hold was iron. She had him completely at her mercy, and everyone in the hallway could see it. The great Blake Morrison, terror of Roosevelt High, was on his knees and helpless, reduced to whimpering by a girl half his size. Please, Blake whimpered, his cocky facade cracking like a mask that had finally been torn away. Please, I'm sorry. I'll leave you alone. For a moment, Kira felt the temptation to hurt him, to make him pay for every humiliation, every moment of fear, every tear she had shed because of his cruelty. She could feel the power flowing through her, the knowledge that she could break his arm with a simple twist of her wrist. After months of abuse, the opportunity for revenge was intoxicating, a chance to balance the scales of justice in a way that felt both satisfying and earned. But even in that moment of supreme power, Master Liu's teachings echoed in her mind. The strongest person is not the one who can cause the most damage, he had told her during one of their philosophical discussions. The strongest person is the one who chooses mercy when they have the power to destroy. She looked down at Blake with something that might have been pity. Here was someone who had built his entire identity around his ability to intimidate and dominate others, only to discover that true strength was something entirely different from what he had imagined. His power had been an illusion, maintained only as long as no one was willing to challenge it. I'm not going to become like you, she said quietly. Her words meant more for herself than for him. But if you ever touch me or Emma again, if you ever hurt someone who can't defend themselves, I won't be so merciful next time. The threat was delivered with the kind of quiet certainty that was more terrifying than any amount of shouting or posturing. Blake had felt her strength firsthand, had experienced the precision and control that spoke to years of serious training. He understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he was not the apex predator he had believed himself to be. She released him, and Blake scrambled backward, clutching his arm and looking at her with a mixture of fear and newfound respect. Trevor and Danny were already pulling themselves to their feet, their faces flushed with embarrassment and pain. The three of them huddled together like refugees from a battlefield, their reputations in ruins and their understanding of the school's social hierarchy completely shattered. Are you okay? Emma appeared at Kira's side, her eyes shining with admiration and concern. The question was simple, but it carried layers of meaning that went far beyond the immediate physical confrontation. She was asking if Kira was hurt, yes, but also if she was ready for the changes that this moment would inevitably bring. I'm fine, Kira said, suddenly aware of all the eyes on her. The hallway was silent, except for the sound of Blake and his friends retreating, their footsteps echoing off the walls like the beating of a retreat. Her hands were still shaking from the adrenaline, but her voice was steady. That was incredible, Emma whispered, her voice filled with genuine awe. Where did you learn to do that? My dad taught me, Kira replied, her breathing slowly returning to normal as the immediate danger passed. He said I should only use it to protect myself or someone I care about. Emma's smile was radiant, lighting up her entire face with a warmth that made Kira's heart skip a beat. Someone you care about? Kira felt her cheeks burn, but she nodded. Yeah, someone I care about. The crowd began to disperse, students whispering excitedly about what they had witnessed. The story would spread through the school like wildfire, growing and evolving with each retelling until it became the stuff of legend. But for once, Kira didn't mind being the center of attention. She had found her voice, her strength, and most importantly, she had discovered that standing up for what was right felt better than any amount of invisibility could offer. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was a whirlwind of activity and emotion that left Kira feeling simultaneously exhilarated and exhausted. Students approached her with a mixture of congratulations and curiosity, some wanting to know about her training, others simply wanting to be associated with the girl who had taken down Blake Morrison. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had spent months trying to blend into the background, but it was also oddly liberating. "Dude, that was like something out of a movie," said Marcus Chen, a quiet kid from her biology class who had never spoken to her before. "How long have you been training?" "Since I was 8, Kira replied, still adjusting to the novel experience of having people genuinely interested in what she had to say. "Could you teach me some moves?" asked Sarah Williams, a freshman who had been one of Blake's more recent targets. "I mean, just the basics?" The requests kept coming throughout the rest of the day and into the following week. Students who had previously looked through her as if she didn't exist were now eager to engage her in conversation, to learn about her background, to understand how someone so small could be so devastatingly effective in a physical confrontation. But the most meaningful change was her relationship with Emma. What had started as lab partner chemistry had blossomed into something deeper and more significant. They spent their lunch breaks together, talking about everything from their favorite movies to their dreams for the future. Emma had a way of making Kira feel seen and valued, not just for her fighting skills, but for who she was as a person. "I always thought you were interesting," Emma admitted one afternoon as they sat in the courtyard, sharing a bag of chips while watching a group of younger students play frisbee on the grass. "But I didn't know how to approach you. You seemed so guarded, like you were protecting yourself from something." "I was protecting myself," Kira said, thinking about how much her life had changed in such a short time. "I've been the new kid enough times to know that standing out usually means getting hurt." "But you stood out anyway," Emma pointed out, her dark eyes sparkling with intelligence and warmth. "Just not in the way you expected." Kira smiled, thinking about her father's words and Master Liu's teachings. "My dad always said that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when you don't want to." The philosophical implications of what had happened were still settling in her mind. She had spent so much energy trying to avoid conflict, trying to be invisible, trying to convince herself that endurance was the same thing as strength. But the confrontation with Blake had taught her that there were times when action was not just justified, but necessary, when standing up to bullies was the only way to stop them from finding new victims. In the days that followed, Roosevelt High felt like a different place. Blake and his friends gave Kira a wide berth, their eyes dropping to the floor whenever they passed her in the hallway. The casual cruelty that had once been their trademark was replaced by nervous glances and whispered conversations. Without their leader's confidence to sustain them, Trevor and Danny seemed lost, unsure of how to navigate a social hierarchy that had been completely restructured by 10 minutes of hallway combat. Other students began to approach Kira with newfound respect. Some wanted to know about her training, others simply wanted to be associated with the girl who had taken down Blake Morrison. She found herself invited to sit at different lunch tables, included in conversations she had never been part of before. The transformation was remarkable and somewhat overwhelming for someone who had spent months trying to remain invisible. "It's weird," she confided to Emma one afternoon as they walked home together, their backpacks slung over their shoulders, and the autumn sun casting long shadows across the suburban streets. "I thought I wanted to be invisible, but now that people actually see me, I realize I was just afraid of being seen for the wrong reasons." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "You were protecting yourself from being hurt, but you were also protecting yourself from being loved. Sometimes the same walls that keep out pain also keep out joy." The observation was profound in its simplicity, and Kira found herself thinking about it long into the evening. How much of her life had she spent in defensive mode, so focused on avoiding negative experiences that she had also avoided positive ones? How many friendships had she missed? How many opportunities had she let slip by, all in the name of safety and invisibility? Her training sessions with Master Liu took on a different quality in the weeks following the confrontation. The elderly instructor had heard about the incident through the martial arts community's informal network of communication, and he watched her with new attention during their practice sessions. "You have learned an important lesson," he said one evening as they cooled down after a particularly intense sparring session. "But remember that victory in combat is not the same as victory in life. True strength comes not from winning fights, but from choosing your battles wisely." "I know," Kira replied, toweling off the sweat from her face and arms. "I didn't want to fight them. I just couldn't let them hurt Emma." Master Liu nodded approvingly. "Then you fought for the right reasons. When we use our skills to protect others rather than to satisfy our own ego, we honor the true spirit of martial arts." The conversation with her instructor helped Kira process what had happened and understand its broader implications. She had crossed a line that day in the hallway, moving from passive victim to active defender, but she had done so for reasons that aligned with her values and training rather than out of simple anger or revenge. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Kira was surprised to find Blake waiting by her locker after school. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders slumped, and his usual swagger replaced by nervous energy. The change was striking. Without his aura of dominance and intimidation, he seemed like just another teenager dealing with problems that were bigger than his ability to solve them. "Can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual arrogance and carrying a note of genuine humility that she had never heard before. Kira studied him for a moment, her hand instinctively moving to her backpack strap in a gesture that had become automatic whenever she felt potentially threatened. But Blake's body language suggested defeat rather than aggression, and his eyes held something that might have been genuine remorse. "What do you want, Blake?" "I wanted to apologize," he said, the words coming out in a rush like water breaking through a dam. "What I did to you, what we did, it was wrong. I know that now." "You know that now?" Kira repeated, her voice carrying a note of skepticism that was probably justified given their history. "You didn't know it was wrong when you were doing it?" Blake's face flushed, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable, like a child who had been caught doing something he knew was wrong, but hadn't fully understood the consequences of his actions. "I don't know what I thought. I guess I liked feeling powerful, and you were an easy target. But seeing you fight back, seeing how strong you really are, it made me realize how pathetic I was being." The admission was more honest than Kira had expected, and she found herself reassessing her opinion of Blake's character. Perhaps there was something redeemable beneath the surface cruelty, some capacity for growth and self-reflection that his previous behavior had hidden. "Apologizing doesn't undo months of torment," Kira said firmly, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that she had discovered during the hallway confrontation. "It doesn't erase the fear or the humiliation." "I know," Blake nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor in a gesture of submission that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. "I can't take back what I did, but I can promise it won't happen again, to you or anyone else." Kira considered his words, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but finding only what appeared to be genuine remorse. His transformation seemed authentic, born not just from fear of her fighting abilities, but from a real recognition of how his behavior had affected other people. "Actions speak louder than words, Blake," she said finally. "If you really want to make amends, prove it by being better." "I will," he said earnestly, meeting her eyes for the first time during their conversation. "I promise." As Blake walked away, his departure lacking the swagger that had once characterized his movement through the school's hallways, Kira felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The confrontation had changed more than just her status at school. It had changed her understanding of herself and her place in the world. She had learned that strength wasn't just about physical ability or fighting skills, but about knowing when to fight and when to show mercy, when to stand up and when to step back. Emma appeared at her side, having watched the exchange from a respectful distance. Her presence had become a constant source of comfort and support, a reminder that not all human interactions had to be based on conflict or competition. "How do you feel?" Emma asked, her voice soft and understanding. "Free," Kira replied, surprising herself with the honesty of the answer. "For the first time in months, I feel free." The word carried layers of meaning that went far beyond the immediate relief of no longer being Blake's target. She felt free from the burden of hiding her true capabilities, free from the exhausting effort of trying to remain invisible, free from the fear that had governed so many of her decisions since arriving at Roosevelt High. They walked out of the school together, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot, where cars were beginning to queue up for the daily exodus of students eager to begin their weekend. Kira no longer felt the need to hide in oversized hoodies or avoid eye contact with her classmates. She had found her voice, her strength, and something even more valuable. She had found someone who saw her for who she really was. The girl who had once been invisible was now impossible to ignore, not because she sought attention, but because she had learned to stand tall and face the world with confidence. Roosevelt High would never be the same, and neither would she. The transformation was internal as much as external, a fundamental shift in how she understood herself and her relationship to the world around her. As they reached the street corner where their paths home diverged, Emma slipped her hand into Kira's, their fingers intertwining naturally. The gesture was simple but profound, a physical connection that represented all the emotional connections that had been forged through shared experience and mutual understanding. "Want to grab some coffee?" Emma asked, her smile lighting up her face with the kind of warmth that made even the grey November afternoon feel bright and full of possibility. "I know this great place downtown." Kira smiled, feeling the warmth of Emma's touch and the promise of whatever came next. "I'd like that." The story of the quiet girl who fought back would become legend at Roosevelt High, passed down through generations of students who heard whispers in the hallways about the day everything changed. The details would evolve and grow with each retelling, but the core truth would remain. Sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who have been hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true strength. But for Kira, it wasn't about becoming a legend or inspiring others, though those were welcome side effects of her actions. It was about finding the courage to be herself, to protect what mattered, and to never let anyone make her feel small again. She had learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying your enemies, but from choosing mercy when you have the power to do harm. In sparing Blake when she could have seriously injured him, she had proven that strength and compassion could coexist, that standing up for yourself didn't require losing your humanity. The lesson would stay with her long after high school, informing her decisions and shaping her character in ways that would echo through the rest of her life. The bullies had grabbed her shirt and shouted, expecting her to cower as she always had. Instead, she had shoved back against their cruelty and found something infinitely more valuable than revenge. She had found herself. The shy, frightened girl who had started the school year, hoping only to survive until graduation, had discovered that she was capable of much more than mere survival. She was capable of protecting others, of standing up for what was right, and of choosing compassion even in moments of supreme power. As she and Emma walked toward downtown, their conversation flowing easily between topics both serious and light-hearted, Kira reflected on how much her life had changed in such a short time. The transformation hadn't been just about learning to fight back against bullies. It had been about learning to fight for something positive, something worth protecting. She had found not just her strength, but her purpose, and that made all the difference in the world.